This
Thank you.
conference will now be recorded.
All right, retrospectives, Antipatterns. Good to have you with us. Aino, congrats on the book.
Thank you.
I know it's a little bit delayed with the paper, the print, but let's have that conversation another time. And let me
Yeah.
just hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, Janus, and welcome everybody for joining me. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about retrospectives, antipatterns, how to make team meetings that don't suck. So as it said in the abstract, I've been facilitating retrospectives for more than 10 years now, and I have done all the mistakes you could possibly make when you facilitate retrospectives. So what I'm going to talk about is what I wrote my book about, is all the mistakes I made and how other people can avoid making the same mistakes as me. So I've just chosen 4 out of the 24 anti-patterns to talk about today because we don't have much time, and I'd like to leave some time for questions. So I'm just going to go through it, and if you want, you can stop me during this talk if you're able to. It's difficult to make me stop talking, but if you can, you're most welcome to, and otherwise we'll take questions in the end.
That works.
So what is a retrospective first? I'm always anticipating that there are some people here who just didn't know what else to do Monday afternoon, so they just showed up not knowing what a retrospective is. So just to make it perfectly clear to everybody what a retrospective is, I'm just going to talk about that. A retrospective is a specific meeting or a session or a ceremony where you have the possibility to share what has happened in a sprint or in a project or in the last week in a period of time. It's a session where you have the opportunity to try and understand why things happened, to appreciate each other, to appreciate what's happening, what are the good things that happened, and to learn from the things that you might want to do differently next time. A lot of people talk about failing fast and having a failing culture where it's okay to talk about failures. A retrospective is a setting where you should build the trust together so that you can talk about the things that didn't go exactly as planned, but spend the time in trying to figure out what we can learn from this, how we can improve. So basically, as my late father said, to understand everything is to forgive everything, and we'll come back to that. But first, let's start with a little story, because this is about a company in Denmark called Titanic AS, which makes reliable navigation software for ships, and it's not going very good for the Titanic AS company. The ships are sinking, the ships are going to the wrong places, they're crashing into icebergs, it's all very bad. So what do they do? Of course, they go on a Scrum course, because that's what you do when things fail. So they all were sent on a Scrum course. And then this little team that we're zooming into is a team with these 6 people: Susan, Kim, Peter, Renee, Sarah, and Jim. And Sarah becomes a Scrum Master because she's the one who's most eager to become the Scrum Master. So because she's a Scrum Master, she is supposed to be facilitating the retrospectives. We'll probably get back to that later, whether she has to do that, but that is what they choose to do. So during the first few weeks in the first sprint, they hear things like, Peter's not doing what he should do. We're all so busy. Peter has to pull himself together. And then at the retrospective, all these things come up to the surface where they're gathering data about what has happened. There's all these post-it notes about Peter leaving early and Peter showing up late for work and Peter not pulling his worth because everybody has to work so hard. And then during the retrospective, Peter leaves the room because he becomes very upset with all the people who are bullying him and shaming him and blaming him for what is going wrong. And the problem here is that when you enter a retrospective, the point is not to find somebody to name and blame. The point is to find the fault in the system and correct the system. So instead of trying to find a scapegoat like Peter, you should enter into a conversation of, how did we end up in this situation? How did we end up in a situation where Peter is supposed to do something that he cannot do? What are the circumstances around Peter that does not enable him to do what the team needs him to do? And for that, the first one who wrote about project retrospectives, Norm Kurth, he wrote what he called the prime directive. And the prime directive goes, regardless of what we discover, we must understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job he or she could, given what was known at the time, his or her skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. And the point is that that is the mindset you should have when you enter a retrospective. And I don't know if all of you, when you enter retrospectives or when you facilitate retrospectives, if you're thinking that everybody always did the best they could with the resources available. But it turns out it's actually pretty hard for people to do that. So Sarah didn't really want to talk about the prime directive before the retrospective because she was a bit worried that some people might think it was too hippie happy or too weird, or they would say, well, we know that some people don't pull their weight, so something has to be done about them. So when the facilitator just forgets about the prime directive and doesn't talk about this mindset, I called it the anti-pattern prime directive ignorance. The prime directive ignorance is the anti-pattern solution that you jump into. You're in the situation where you want to facilitate a retrospective, and you know that you should talk about the prime directive. You know that you should make people aware that you should actually believe everybody did the best they could. But it's a bit embarrassing to talk about it because these are hardcore developers and you're afraid they might laugh at you. So in each of these anti-patterns, I have the anti-pattern solution, which is what you would normally do, and then you would be in the situation that Sarah was in, where Peter was bullied out of the room. Now, if they could have actually believed in the prime directive, if they'd had the mindset, then perhaps they would have asked Peter instead, what happened for you? Why did you have to go so early? Why didn't you pull your weight when we were all so busy? Perhaps they would have created a place of trust where they could talk about things that goes wrong. Perhaps they would know then that Peter had some issues in his private life that make it impossible for him to work the full 40 hours that he was supposed to do. But they didn't give him that chance because they needed a scapegoat. And the point here with an anti-pattern is that first you have the anti-pattern solution, which is the bad thing and the bad consequences, but then there's a refactored solution. And that is the way that you solve this solution that you are in now. It could be that you solve it right at that moment, or you can solve it at the next retrospective. In this case, if you've ignored the prime directive, then the retrospective process probably has been painful or harmful to some people, but the next time you should remember the prime directive. And you could do that in various ways. You could bring the prime directive either on a whiteboard, or you can, if it's an online retrospective, you can send it in an email the day before or a few days before. It doesn't have to be the words that you just saw. You could put it in your own words. You can just put in the email, remember, we want to try to find faults in the system and learn from that instead of finding scapegoats. Use your own words that you feel comfortable with. And then during the retrospective, you might need to remind those that need it, because there might be some people who forget if they're not used to being in that mindset where they're finding learning possibilities instead of scapegoats. Maybe you need to remind them there's a prime directive here and we're not trying to point fingers at anybody. So please remove that post-it note with the name on it. And the picture I have to sort of illustrate this prime directive ignorance is this picture. In the book I have these octopuses because I like octopuses, and this is a prime directive ignorance figure where you can see that there are fingers being pointed or tentacles being pointed at the little fish, and the fish feels very bad about it. So if you don't remember to have that mindset when you facilitate the retrospectives, then some people will feel bad at some point. But time goes on, and Sarah has to facilitate another retrospective, and this retrospective is now an online retrospective because COVID has started. So everybody is at home and she has to facilitate an online retrospective. So she starts the retrospective at the time that she put in the calendar, and then she hears people say, oh, it's the retrospective now, and then they dial in quickly. They're in the video a little bit late, maybe a few minutes late, and then she hears them say, well, where's the link again? Because she's prepared a document that they should work on in the online retrospective, but people can't find the link because it was in the email and in the calendar invitation, and it's gone, and they haven't really paid attention to it. And then because she's facilitating a retrospective where there's 3 people still working together in one room and everybody else, because of COVID, has not come to the office, she can hear that there's some small talk between the people sitting in the same room. And she also hears people saying when they've started talking to each other, oh, did we get a password for this document? So there's a lot of delayment before the actual retrospective can take place. because people have all these things that are struggling with. How can I enter this video communication? Where's the link again? Do I need a password? And things like that. And that is the anti-pattern that I call disregard preparation, because disregard preparation is something that happens often with online retrospectives, that you disregard the enormous amount of preparation that you actually have to put into a online retrospective to make it a good one. And what happens if you disregard it are the things that we just heard about before. Your retrospective starts late, people are small talking if they're in the same room together, and they don't know where the document is. So the refactored solution is to do some different things, tips and tricks for online retrospectives. And one is to send an email the day before with a link to the document and a link to the video to remind them that this is where we should be. And also, if it's a new document, if it's like a new media, mural or Miro that they haven't tried before, then it's good that they've tried the day before to actually enter the document and don't have to do it after the meeting has started. Also, send an email 15 minutes before the meeting. Because if people were having the meeting, the retrospective offline in the office, then when they got up to move to the other room where the meeting would take place, they would go past the coffee machine and they would go past the toilet and they would be reminded that they needed to drink and have a bio break. But if they're sitting at home all day, then they're not reminded about that. So remind them 15 minutes before the meeting that now is a good time to get coffee or go to the toilet if you need that. Because otherwise you'll either have people coming late or people who are like being very unsettled on the chair. Insist on video for all. And this is a bit controversial. There's a lot of people who are saying, I shouldn't have to show my video in a meeting online because that's up to me whether I want to share my face or not. And I completely understand there can be some reasons for not showing your face on video. For a seminar like this, see your faces on video. I'm looking at Aino, who's sometimes happy and sometimes looking a little bit worried and now waving at me. That's very good feedback for me that he hasn't fallen asleep or something like that. But for a retrospective, it's actually really important to be able to see people's faces on video. There's a lot of body language that you need to read in a retrospective because you want to hear everybody's side of the story about what's going on. You want to acknowledge if somebody is afraid to say something and give them room to say something or write something. If you see that people are getting angry or if they're like really wanting to say something, it's good to be able to see them so that you can help them say something or help them be quiet or help them get an answer to some of their questions. If you're only talking to a black screen, it is extremely important to facilitate a retrospective, and thus it's extremely difficult to find out if you're just talking to black screens, whether somebody is doing something completely different or whether they want to say something, or whether you should change the subject because this is now becoming boring for them. So if people show up to a retrospective without the video, even though I ask them, I will ask them not at the retrospective, but I'll ask them afterwards, just so one-on-one, why were you not on video? I mean, there can be different reasons. If it's because they don't want to see themselves on video, you can hide your self view. If it's because they don't want to show the background, maybe they can blur the background. If it's because they're taking the meeting from a car, that's just not acceptable, because if you want to facilitate a retrospective and attend a retrospective, you shouldn't do it from a cafe or your car because you need the full attention. So try to insist on video for all, but of course, if they have some reasons that are really good for not being on video, then it would be okay, but it just makes your work as a retrospective facilitator a lot harder. Make sure everybody is equal, because if some people are sitting in the same room and other people are satellites remotely, then they're not equal. The people sitting in the same room together, they can do small talk. They can perhaps just lift their eyebrows or write something on some piece of paper, and even the way that people smell can tell you, oh, he or she is getting a bit angry with me, or they are happy. So you're making it very unequal if some people are sitting together and other people are sitting remotely. So I try to tell people that if somebody is remote, everybody should be remote, which is a bit weird, that they should then use 3 rooms instead of 1 if people can actually sit together. But it just makes it a lot easier for the facilitator if everybody's equal. Now use an avatar. If it's only 1 or 2 people who are remote and the rest is in the same room, then maybe you want to use a whiteboard. You want to make people walk around. You want to be able to see the body language, who's standing together with who's turning their backs to somebody else. And then you can use an avatar. And that means that one of the people who are in the actual room can be an avatar for the one who's remote. So they have a direct connection on their phone or something like that. So the one who's remote can talk directly to his or her avatar and make them put post-it notes on the wall or something like that. For an online retrospective, it's even more important than it is for an offline retrospective to make a strict agenda. To simply say, well, these are the things we're going to go through in this retrospective. We're going to have the introduction, we're going to gather data about what happened, we're going to generate insights, we're going to decide what to do, and we're going to close the retrospective. And the different activities that you choose to have in those phases, it's very important to write down. I think this is going to take 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 7 minutes, and then have an alternative agenda if this doesn't work out. If things take longer, if you find something that you hadn't anticipated that you need to spend some more time on. And don't record it if it's a retrospective, because in a retrospective you want trust. You want to be able to say things that didn't go very well, that you might be a little bit ashamed of or you're worried about. Don't record it, because it'll just make people unable to say exactly what they mean. We want to have a trusting session for a retrospective. And this is the picture that illustrates the disregard for preparation, where you can see the poor facilitator is trying to go through the agenda and all the fish are doing whatever they want to do because they're not on video, so nobody can see what they're actually doing. For the next retrospective, we see something that I call the Groundhog Day retrospectives. Things are popping up at the retrospective again and again. And it's the same thing they continue to discuss. And people are being a bit aggravated about it. They say, oh, the boss will never allow us to have this testing framework. We always discuss the same things. Why can't the retrospective help us? We never get anything changed. And people are saying, oh, these retrospectives are a complete waste of time because we don't really change the big things that we want to change. So the anti-pattern I've called in the soup. And I'll explain to you why I call it in the soup. Some of you might know this activity, which is the circles and soup activity, where you draw 2 circles and the innermost circle is the things that the team can do something about. The next circle is the things that the team can influence, and outside these 2 circles is the soup, the things that you just have to adapt to. So you can say it's like circles of influence as well. You can talk about different things here, perhaps a code review, all major changes, that's something that the team can do something about. The communication with the testers is bad. That's not something that they can do something about on their own. They need to have the testers as well. So it's only something that they can influence. And then the location of the company, we want to change that. That's in the soup. That's just something you need to adapt to. The interesting thing about this activity that I use both after I've gathered data, but also when I'm looking at the solutions, is that there are actually some things you can do if you look into it. Maybe you can move closer to the testers. That's something that you can do as a team. And that means that maybe it is now in your actually do circle, and maybe you can come up with reasons for a local hub, and that will make you influence the problems that you have with the location of the company. So in the soup is where the team is trying to solve problems that are outside their reach of influence. So it means it could be like getting a new testing framework. Maybe it's the manager decision, and they continue to discuss it because that's what's on their mind. That's important for them. But it's like this little octopus. They're trying to lift a weight that they can't lift alone. So I use this as an exercise for people in a team. They put up the post-it notes. They said, we have all these problems, and I make the circles activity. And then I say, sometimes there's a team that doesn't want to take responsibility for anything. And then I can see that a lot of the things are out in the soup. And I can say, well, aren't there any of the things that you have any influence on? Can't you do anything about that? And other times I ask a team to do that, and they have a lot of things in the do. And that means that this team is emancipated, that it's empowered enough to do something about the things. If there are some things in the soup that keeps coming up that the team is really interested in changing, then perhaps you should invite more people to the retrospective, because if you invite more people to the retrospective, the circles of influence becomes larger, because it could be the manager or it could be the testers or something like that. So I try to speak as little as possible, and has asked me to put this picture up in somewhere in the presentation. But this is a time to ask questions.
Thank you. I will make sure to also include this link in the blog post. Did I count wrong that you said you brought 4 antipatterns?
Yeah, and I only talked about 3. It was because,
Okay,
yeah,
just checking.
I brought 4, but I could see after I was finished with the first one that I had to leave one out.
No problem. You changed the agenda on the fly.
Yeah,
Well done.
exactly.
So let's open it up to questions, comments, reflections. I can imagine what might happen is that Aino says there's an anti-pattern for that, but let's start with you, David.
So great talk. I love the circles. Going to steal that right away. But my question to you is about doing this cross-culturally. So I've spent the last 18 months building an agile team across multiple geos, one of which is India. And one of the issues we find there is that in India, they seem to find the process of saying that something wasn't right almost threatening. Very difficult for them to do that, right? No matter how much we encourage and deal with we don't use the term prime directive, but those sort of sentiments. Have you encountered that, and what do you do about it?
Yes, I have encountered that. And I mean, there are various ways of dealing with that. The quick trick, perhaps, which has worked for me a few times, is to make it completely anonymous. I've seen that sometimes where I made a Google Doc, a Google drawing for the online document, and for a Google drawing, and from others, I think also from Ural and others, you're able to set the link to people so that they can anonymously access the document. And when they see that other people are completely anonymous, for instance, in the Google drawings, it's anonymous easel and anonymous ant and anonymous Pocahontas and things like that, then they can see and they feel secure that whatever they write is actually completely anonymous and nobody's being punished for that, because but that's a quick and dirty one, right? That's just working with what you have. Of course, it would be wonderful if you could change that culture, if you could make them feel safe and secure that they could say what they want, but that's a longer journey, and I'm not sure that you can actually change that in a retrospective. I try to talk about when it comes to teaching retrospectives, but also child upbringing, that the behavior that you want is the one that you should give attention, right? So if people are saying something negative, if you give that attention more than the solutions, then you might work up a culture where, in order to get attention, you will say something which is bad. Or you could do what I sometimes do as well, is having a future perspective, where I ask people, what do you think could go wrong in the next month? So that is not saying that this went wrong. This is just saying that they are worried that it goes wrong. So you're you're making a proxy for their feelings. It's not them saying that this is wrong with the management or something like that, but they saying, oh, I've heard about others who had this problem. And even though it's cheating in a way, because it's a way of looking into their heads and learning what they don't like. Does it make sense?
It does.
Do you have more questions, or are there any other questions?
I have lots of questions, but as Janusz knows, I could easily monopolize the whole thing, so I'm stopping because I don't want to do that.
I can't hear you, Janus, but I see Marie wants to ask a question.
Yep,
Yes,
let's just hand it over to Maria.
Sorry.
I was wondering what's the balance between doing the same over and over again for retrospective and towards changing it a bit to get renewed energy. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, that's a very good question that I get a lot. The firm answer is it depends. Sorry. It depends on the team. It depends on the facilitator. I know that there are some teams who want the same type of retrospective every time, because then they can prepare for it. Like, I have some teams that I facilitate for. I facilitated for them for years. They like the timeline every time. And sometimes when I try to spice it up and I do something else, they're like, oh, we prepared for the timeline. We don't like that. But for like the most teams, I would say that every third time I have the same type of retrospective. It could be like the team radar, where you vote for how is the communication, how's the happiness, how's the quality of work, or the timeline. So every third time they have something that they know works for them and that they like, so that they feel secure. Those who want to feel secure can feel secure. And then 2/3 of the time I try to do something new. And when I say something new, it's probably every second or every third week you have a retrospective. So you can, of course, reuse the things after a few months. It's okay to reuse it again. But I don't think you should not necessarily feel that you have to do something new every time. And I think you should ask the team every time you try something new, how did they like it? What did they get out of it? And what did you expect them to get out of it as well? And then sometimes perhaps I didn't have time for that, but as I said in the beginning, Sarah, in our little situation, she was the facilitator of all the retrospectives because she's a Scrum Master, but actually it does not have to be the Scrum Master who's facilitating all the retrospectives, because the Scrum Master is part of the team and should also just be at a retrospective as a team member from time to time. And then somebody else should facilitate, and then that person probably finds a new activity or perhaps does the old activity in a new way. Did that answer the question, Marie?
Very good. So I think we have 1 minute left. Who wants to go? Final question, anybody?
It has to be a yes and no question.
Yeah, pretty much. Or I can also, in closing, perhaps challenge you, Aino, with a closing, parting insight that you want to share with us.
Yeah, a parting insight that I want to share with you is, some people think that being a good facilitator is about knowing a lot of activities. And in the beginning, when I started my facilitator journey, I was embarrassed when I didn't know what the team radar or the ship retrospective meant. But after I've been doing it for so many years, I know that that's not the important thing. You can always Google that. You can always find these things. What is important is actually listening, figuring out who to make shut up, who to make speak a bit more, and how to set a stage which makes people relax and trust each other. So I think that the psychology and the body language is actually much more important than knowing a lot of activities, in my opinion.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We did it.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for now.
Thank you for
I'll be in touch
joining.
with the blog post and the recording. Congratulations once again on the book, Aino. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.